Hello people. Today we're looking at the trends in history and historiography after World War I. And we're really focusing on the idea of postmodernism and post-structuralism. So the aims of today are to recognise postmodernist approaches as our first aim. Our second aim is to see some examples of that approach. And our third and final aim is for you to form your own assessment of the value of these movements. So let's make a start. People, during this recording, I'm actually going to move quite quickly, so feel free to pause this video whenever you need. Let's just start with a very lightning overview. If we start with our pre-modern period here, we've been writing history for roughly 2,000 years, and to some extent it was the pursuit of amateurs. So Thucydides was a general, as you know. And particularly for characters such as Bede, writing history was done for a number of aims. For Bede, it was partly to show the role of God on the earth, his role as creator. It was to give exemplars for people of how to live through the lives of the saints. And it also had a didactic or teaching role for his congregations and for his fellow monks. If we move to modernism, which really begins in the 18th century, we have this idea of empiricism. Research is taking place. We're using sources, particularly primary sources, as a way to prove a proposition from the historian. We still have the ideas of great meta-narratives of history. We're still looking for wide audiences, but we're also concerned about themes such as nationalisms. And modernism really takes up the historical period from definitely the mid-1850s with Gibbon and then Rank up until maybe the 1930s. Now, postmodernism is a reaction to and a critique and a reassessment of modernist theory. And it really is a reaction that was caused by a loss of certainty and a loss of optimism. We're looking at historians and the historical theorists from about the 1930s. The key tenet of postmodernism is that there is no one absolute truth. The truth is relative, and this means there can be multiple perspectives, multiple truths. The truth is subjective and it's relative. Now we add to postmodernism the theories of post-structuralism from around about the 1960s, and we'll move on to that shortly. Now if we compare those pre-three schemes, if we look at pre-modern history and think, what does it really look like? Pre-modern history has long stories, often in narratives. It's a whole life of a saint. It's a whole history of the Peloponnesian Wars. The historian collects and to some extent interprets evidence. Thucydides was very keen on saying that he really tried to be objective, but historians, and particularly Thucydides, did embellish. Okay, so he in particular invented dialogue. Their purpose was to inform, and it was to influence their audience about important people and events. And their sources varied in quality. In the pre-Gutenberg period, we're looking at the sources that they could access through speaking to people or that they happened to have on site. Those written sources did tend to focus on the elite of society. Now, when we move to the modern period of history, we have a more dense and a more exacting field. By the time we get to modern history, we realise there are competing meta-narratives that can be influenced by factors such as political ideology. Marxism is one example of that. There are more historians, and they're far more professional. They have greater access to information and sources, and their concern is for scientific objectivity and truth. This is empirical research and empirical expertise. There is a shift to broader studies rather than simply narratives. Okay? Now, the sources reflect the fact that we have a more educated population. There are more of them. And we have this explosion, particularly in the late 19th century, of archaeology. So we have more, if you like, things to think about and look at in constructing our histories. And particularly from von Rank, we have a strong emphasis on the importance of primary sources. Now, when we flash forward to postmodern history, it is important to recognise that postmodernists really dislike the concept of a meta-narrative, of an overarching theme or story. They tend to focus on individuals and groups who have been displaced or ignored by historical circumstance. They're interested in an interdisciplinary approach. That means that they don't see historians as necessarily a profession with detailed training in that special field. Postmodernists have, if you like, a more egalitarian view of who can and should be a historian. Now, in terms of sources, there is far less reverence for the purity of the primary source. Postmodernists would contend that the past is not encapsulated in those sources. It's simply a written or created version of the past. And the interpretation of it by historians adds another layer. Okay, people, so let's bring that together a bit. If we're looking at an early postmodernist would tell us that there are objective certainties that they can find, and they're bolstered by scientific proofs. They believe that facts and truth exist, and their challenge as a historian is to uncover them and present them logically and objectively. There is an assumption of continuity. The past has shaped the present. And there is also an assumption of progress, that change is generally cumulative. It does represent a forward, progressive direction, and change is rational. The postmodernist, on the other hand, and it's all in one lump, doesn't believe that there is an objective or universal truth. Their view is relative. Writing history is a process of constructing a version of the truth. Now, the first name I want you to write down is Roland Barthes, and he held that language is of itself an expression of power, and our use of it is subjective. It's about how we manipulate power. One of his successors was a linguist like Barthes, and his name was Hayden White. And Hayden White, who was again very famous, argues that basically history is a story. According to White, if you put a historical novel next to a history, they are basically narratives. And we do that because we're using narrative to make sense of the past. We're basically artificially imposing some form of order on chaos. Now, many people would argue that you can tell the difference between a history which is reference to external facts and written in quite an objective way, to a historical novel which is likely to be highly emotional and evocative. But if we simply look at the structure of a narrative rather than the details of the language, Hayden White does have a little bit of a point there. Okay, so a cartoon to oversimplify. If you're a modernist, you see somebody, you do an artwork, you can say, I am a genius. If you are a postmodernist, you realise that actually the word genius is an actual cultural construct. It's a subjective term. In that word genius, you have decided what matters as a form of intelligence, how you're going to measure it, and that this chap over here has demonstrated that wonderful thing, genius. Ultimately, it's a cultural construct. It's subjective to that particular time, space, race, and society. It's not an absolute truth. The person who thinks that naturally knows that objectively they are in fact a genius. Okay, well, let's have a look at what good history really looks like. If you are a modernist, you know that you are going to put forward a coherent and plausible version of the past. You're going to support your historic proposition with evidence from sources, as you did in your essays, and you're going to aim for objectivity, trying to use neutral language. You may even look at different perspectives and try and mediate between them. Now, in all of this, logically, your imagination is subordinated. Your creativity could undermine your accuracy. You are looking primarily to interpret the facts. Now, if you are a good postmodernist, you would say that putting forward that version is basically a form of implotment. You are developing a story. When you are supporting your evidence, you are selecting material, so you are omitting some information. And there is also a dialectic. You are trying to put forward some kind of argument to support it. And your language, no matter how much you try to be neutral, is a political construct, and it will always be contaminated. Okay, so pause for just a second to think through that, look at the difference between the two, then move on. Okay, so people, brace yourself. From the Scotch College in Victoria, as an example, I found you a sample of one of their former students. Now, Scotch College has actually produced biographies of all of its former students who fought in World War I. They're on their website. If we look at this from a modernist Rankian perspective, it's an excellent and brief account of the life of James Burns. I'm going to ask you to pause this again and just read it through. Okay, so hopefully you've paused and read it through. You'll note that I've put some text in bowls. We just whiz through it. We have the facts that are so beloved of the modernists. A detailed account of his birth, suggesting a birth certificate was sourced, his roles at school, prefect, member of the first rowing 8, so obviously a sportsman, and school vice captain. But then we have some additional information that I think a postmodernist would argue has been selected for a particular purpose and is influencing us as readers. Now, bearing in mind this is a school website, the website claims that Burns left a lasting legacy to the school, which includes he wrote the boating song, still sung today, so validating that his role has continued for almost 100 years. And what's going on with James was a student when he enlisted. It's a true statement of fact, but the way it is expressed lets the reader know that this man had very little chance at an ordinary life or to achieve much. He was still at school. And he died at Gallipoli at the age of 20. I would suggest to you that the section at the top has been selected to position James as a loss to the school and to assert his importance in that context. Underneath service record, something interesting happens. It actually opens with Jim Burns' poem from England became famous throughout the empire. And then after a couple of sentences it says JD would never see England, even though he wrote about it. Now, with all respect to the person who constructed this, this may have occurred while he was enlisted, but it's actually not part of his military service. So we have to think, why is this referred to in this section? And I would suggest to you that this service record has been constructed partly through the lens of the Anzac myth and the Anzac legend. JD Jim Burns is a young man who fell with his face to the foe. He was a young man whose talent and promise was palpable and was wasted in war. He was a young man who demonstrated those essential Anzac values of courage and mateship. He was praised for helping to maintain morale and order when they were under fire from torpedoes. He was killed because his high sense of duty caused him to try and attack the Turks when it was hopeless to do so. So if we think about that through some of the key elements of postmodernist theory of history, if this history has been written in a familiar genre, it's a biography. Yeah? The language has been an enabler and also a restrictor on the historian's creativity. I've learned some things about Mr. Burns, but I haven't learned a great deal. I don't know whether he was a bully. I don't know if he was a larrikin. I don't know whether he stuck his head above a trench because he was actually quite stupid and a show-off, or whether he was genuinely incredibly brave. There is some interpretation there, and in that interpretation I think there is a sense that there's been a mutation, a change of the past. Now, I have no doubt that sources were used to construct that particular work, but if we look to the central tenet, it's a good example that histories are made from and are of themselves constructed texts. They're not the originals of the past. Okay, so a key issue in post-structuralism is language. Post-structuralism builds on the concepts of postmodernism by basically putting a very strong focus on the principle that it's not just what we say, it's the way that we say it. Post-structuralism really started to move from the 1960s. Now, the modernist assumption is that language reflects the composer's thoughts and reality. And we know that context, audience and purpose are significant, but if we approach them methodically, The modernist says, well, we can understand and discount their effect. So down here for you, I have some words from Shakespeare. When Shakespeare says habit, he means clothing or costume and uniform. He doesn't mean the habit of getting up early, going to school. And if somebody is wont to do something, it means they do something regularly. It's not a grammatical error, and they've left out the apostrophe. So the modernist says, yes, I understand that language changes over time, but I can learn about those changes and decode the meaning. The post-structuralist says, oh, no, you can't. They argue that language operates through a system of signs, and there's no absolute laws to it. And even if you can look at some of those laws, what's omitted and the spaces may matter almost as much as what is actually said. So the post-structuralist key argument is that we actually have no way of accessing reality without using language. And when we use language, we have inaccuracies. Language is incapable of accessing reality perfectly. It's an approximation only. Okay, so I have here an example I found from good old Andrew Bolt, who said, Greta Thunberg, the green advocate, is not the Messiah. She's an extremely anxious girl. Now, the statement refers to a scene from the movie by Monty Python called The Life of Brian. It's a British comedy. It was released in 1979, which shows how old Mr. Bolt is. What I can't tell from this particular example is why he included it. What was he trying to imply from it? Was he merely trying to get across that he's influenced by the British? Did he want to show that he has some intelligence and is capable of structuring a pun? Did he want to criticise her followers, that they are somehow mystics? They're following through some kind of belief rather than actual knowledge. Is this an Andrew Bolt message that climate change is not real? I can't be sure. More importantly, I don't think anyone could be sure. So if we think about it, language is contentious. So before we move on to two precise examples of postmodern historians, just keep in mind that most of these people operate in several fields. Okay, they're not pure historians who are dedicated only to the construction of historical thought. And most of them have a philosophical or linguistic background. Okay. They are united in the view that there are multiple views on and versions of the past, but apart from that, they really do diverge. So let's look at two and then stop. To help you out, I'm sure you have looked at Webb's extension history. You'll note that there's a chapter in it on postmodern historians. There's a brief summary on this slide, so you might wish to stop and just take down a couple of notes. But let's move on for now. One of the key historical thinkers is Michel Foucault. Now, Foucault was interested in examining systems of thought over time. His work covers a wide range of subjects, but the central idea is power. He looks at the way power is exercised, who is dominant, who is in opposition to it, and he tended to move towards the marginalised. He didn't see history in terms of the conventional hierarchies of upper and lower class, and that's largely because he tended to look at different modes of participation and themes that are not necessarily based on economic or social position. Now, one of the reasons that he was so interested in power was that he actually believes that writing history is often a way to use knowledge as a mechanism to either gain or maintain power. So he sees history as a way of asserting importance. And the Scotch College website's possibly an example of that. Now, when we look at one of his key works, one of his earliest is called, exotically enough, The History of Sexuality, and it's in 3 volumes, which I've condensed to 7 lines. So basically, in A History of Sexuality, he was aware of and challenged the theory that Victorian England was a sexually repressed and silenced era. Basically, the theory goes that Victorian England was influenced by its queen, Victoria, and when she came to the throne, she was young, she herself was interested in sex, she enjoyed it very much with her husband Albert, but particularly after his death, she became more and more conservative, and so did the values of that society. And sex basically was hidden and made into something disgusting. Now, against that, Foucault makes an argument that there was actually an intensification of interest in sex, and it proliferated. It became, however, a social and power construct. So people did talk about it, but just in different ways. So during that period, homosexuality, for example, was positioned as deviant. It wasn't that there were no homosexuals or that they were silenced. It's that their discourse had to be controlled or they risked arrest. Okay, so if we look at the benefits of a postmodernist, post-structuralist approach, there's no doubt that it's interesting, it's innovative, and it can bring out new ideas. But sometimes it lacks academic rigor. And Foucault is one of those who has been criticised for basically a lack of footnotes, a lack of referencing, a lack of proof of his sources. So if we can summarise it at this point very quickly, if we think about what the post-structuralists share, like the postmodernists, there's a belief in the relative nature of truth, but there's a stronger focus on what the actual text is, and they can even look at layout and format as ways of constructing meaning. So post-structuralists look for the exceptions, and as part of their focus on language, they've actually brought back the role of imagination and narrative in history. And that brings us to our second person, who is Simon Sharma. Now, Simon Sharma is a professor with a strong interest in historiography. He's a polymath, he's erudite, he's a TV star, and he's written several serious histories which have been well received. Sharma believes that if history cannot be definitive, then at the very least it needs to be engaging and immersive. He fully accepts there can be multiple views of history, and he contends that history is changing and it will continue to change. And that change is partly because we don't know what's happened, and partly because it is subjective. History is how we respond to the past, not the past itself. Okay, well, let's just apply that very quickly to our poor Mr. Burns, who's back on the screen. So I would suggest to you that Burns is recorded through the lens of an Anzac, and the language of his story has been constructed to put him forward as young, brave, as a good mate, who fell as all good Anzacs should, with his face to the foe. Now, he is presented in the mould of a national stereotype. Sharma might argue to you that by creating his own story, there's a degree that it's been personalised. We don't just have an Anzac, we have an Anzac with a face, and that face gives us some level of interest. Michael Foucault, on the other hand, would say that the whole website, developed by Scotch College, is using knowledge to generate and maintain their power, that it's a way of them expressing their role in World War I and taking control of that narrative to some extent. Now, I could point out here that there could be other interpretations of J.B. Burns, and indeed of any of the Anzacs. Okay? But the facts have been presented in a very particular way to lead to a particular conclusion. And thus we have a young man who fits in very nicely and neatly to the Anzac legend. So if we bring that together again, postmodernists, and some of them are revisionists, do share the view that the past is constructed rather than just discovered. We only have representations of the past, not the absolute truth. These representations can be tested and contested. As we indulge in that practice, we need to be aware that our selection of material and its actual presentation are creating layers of meaning which can also distort the past. Now, one of the weaknesses of the postmodernist and post-structuralist approach is that with this liberation of history, this freedom to construct your own version of the past becomes a really interesting question. When does history pass from being actually a history? It's valid, it's subjective, it's quirky, but it's plausible. When does it pass from being a history into something that is absolutely ahistorical? And if we look at it, the classic case of that is, in fact, the Irving trial. And I will look at that very, very briefly in a second recording. That's all, folks. Please read over your notes carefully. Let me know if there are any issues.